All right, thank you so much for having me today. I'm Bianca Reisdorf from the Quello Center, and I just want to endorse everything Pierrette has just said. It's so important that we talk about this issue, so I'm really happy that you're all here today. So I'm very briefly going to give you a short overview of what we actually do at the Quello Center. We do a lot of digital divide, digital inequality studies, and all of the reports that we do are available publicly on the internet. So if you're interested in any of the reports, for example, the one that Pierrette just mentioned, the Wilma project, they're all available. I can get you the links if you want to look at those. I'm going to give you data from two studies that we did in Michigan recently. One is about Michigan at large, and the other one is specifically about Detroit, a project that's very close to my heart. And we just finished that project in December, actually. So these are brand new data just from the field. And then I will finish that off with my key takeaways that I hope will be useful for you as well. So our center looks at large at telecommunications policy and issues around telecommunications for us as a society. And so we're a big team. As you can see, you can't see all the names, but from left to right, we have Bill Dutton, our director, Lalia Fernandez, who was instrumental in our Detroit project, and myself, Keith Hampton, who was also on the Detroit project. He's a social capital expert. If you've heard of Keith Hampton, he's doing all that work about social capital. Alex Yankelevich, who was instrumental on the Merit project, on the Wilma project. Mitch Shapiro, who was also instrumental on that, and then our research assistant, Wisnu Trivibowo, who was also part of all these projects that I'm going to talk about. So some of the studies that we've done in the last few years include the Wilma project that was just mentioned to examine what kinds of options we could have in rural Michigan to get all those households online. And then we also did a Digital Divides in Michigan project that was actually made possible through IPPSR, through a small grant that we got from them to actually collect data and do some analysis here. And then finally, we did a Broadband to the neighborhood study in Detroit, in the neighborhoods of Detroit. And so these are just some of the studies we're doing. We're also doing other work on more specific issues like digital inequalities, and race is something that I'm working on a lot. And then I'm doing a project around parole and the internet and how ICTs could actually potentially increase success stories in reentry. But that's a different story, not today. So the first study I want to talk to you about today is about Michigan at large. And so what we wanted to do is see where Michigan fared in terms of digital divides at large in comparison to the US. So how did internet use and access spread throughout Michigan over the last 20 years? What are the attitudes of Michiganders? Do they actually want to be online? Are they not that interested? Are they worried about being online? Because there's a lot of myths floating around, and we're going to debunk some of those today. And then also, what were the key barriers that kept people offline? And so I'm saying 2016 here because that's when we got the data, that's the data collection. The methodology was that we use state-of-the-state survey data, which are collected by MSU through IPPSR, I think 3 to 4 times a year. It's a really great survey. It's about 1,000 respondents through a telephone survey. And the beautiful thing was that throughout the years, people can add their questions. You essentially buy questions in the survey, and you have the standard battery of questions as well. And as it turns out, as early as 1997, people were interested in what's going on with the internet in Michigan. And so that was great for us, because then we went through all the data sets and looked at, okay, where do we have data on internet use and access? And so we compared over time what was going on there, who's online, who's offline, and what does it look like in comparison to the US. And then finally, for the 2016 survey, we added our own questions, which included a lot of questions on attitudes toward the internet and also reasons for being offline. So this is a little small, but this is internet use by education over time. So this is the beauty of this, the state of the state survey, that things like education, income, things like that are always in the data set. So we were able to compare across time who is actually connected and who isn't. And so the yellow line at the very top, those are people who have higher education qualifications, so any college education at all. And then at the very bottom, the blue line, we see people who say they have no college or no school education. They didn't finish school. And in between orange, we have what we called more basic qualifications, so high school diploma. And then we have the further qualifications, which would be community college or a little bit of college but didn't finish the degree. And so we can see here a very stark difference between the different education levels. And this is a classic. This is something that we see all throughout the country. But it's also something that is a little depressing because it's not going away. So we can see here at the very end, we see that it's coming a little closer together in 2016, which is beautiful for me to see as a digital inequality researcher, but we still have a lot of work to do. And the same is true for race. So this was a little more frustrating for me, especially as someone who researches this all the time, that we see the gap widening here again in 2016. So we have this persistent gap throughout the, throughout the whole time, and it's just not closing. So we have work to do at that level as well. And this is fairly typical to what we see across the US, and Michigan is average in terms of internet use and internet access numbers to the US, but actually the racial gap in our data here is a little bit bigger than in the US wide data. We then also wanted to know, what do people think about the internet? Because, as I said before, sometimes what we hear is that people are not interested or people are too worried about their privacy and things like that. People don't quite understand what the internet actually could afford them. So we asked all people, so regardless of whether they said they're online or they're not, we asked them what they think about the internet. And so some of the questions were, so to the left, you can't see this unfortunately because it's too small, but these are efficiency things, like it saves me time, it's an efficient tool for finding information, it's easier to stay in touch with people. So people really largely agreed with all those sentiments. But then people really disagreed with things like it's easier to meet people online, or people don't feel lonely online. So what we kind of gathered from that was that Michiganders really do feel like there is efficiency, and they understand that. But at the same time, they're a little worried about, you know, people maybe getting lost on the internet in terms of spending too much time with other people and actually feeling more lonely. And also Michiganders have more issues around things like inappropriate materials. So that was above national average. So we had some comparative data that we could look at. It's for Michiganders, what we found, they really regard this as a tool that makes them efficient. And that kind of goes with, you know, in Michigan we grind, right? So it goes with the general attitude towards life. But this is something that we can actually leverage in terms of policies as well, that we do know what people are worried about. And this was especially interesting when looking at people who don't use the internet. They were more worried about things like privacy and immoral material, and then also about, you know, this notion that people might actually spend too much time online and actually feel more lonely. But these are things we can address. These are things we can put in information campaigns and really tell people, no, actually, you know, you can circumvent all these things. There are tools that you can use to stay safe and, you know, really work on those efficiency attitudes and really endorse those. The second study I want to talk about is the Detroit study. And so this is a map you might have seen before. Everything that is red has a poverty rate above 35%. And everything that is green has 18 megabits per second broadband speeds available. So you can see here that the poorer areas do not necessarily have the same infrastructure as the areas who don't have high poverty rates. So this is something that we got really interested in, and that Rocket Fiber also got interested in. Has anyone heard of Rocket Fiber before? A handful of people? Okay, so Rocket Fiber is a company in Detroit who is interested in rolling out broadband. And they already have very high broadband speeds in Midtown and all the buildings that they've bought. You have 1 gigabit per second download speeds and upload speeds. So that is something that is way beyond the broadband definition that we have from the FCC. And so they're interested in rolling this out in other neighborhoods as well. And so they wanted to know, okay, we have all these myths going around Detroit. What is actually going on? And we've been wanting to know this for years. So when Rocket Fiber asked if we wanted to do the study, we were all in, of course. So we wanted to look at, first of all, what does connectivity in Detroit look like? We always hear numbers between 40 to 60% who are offline, but we don't really have good data to say this is true or it's not true. So we tried to kind of rectify that. And then we also wanted to know who is offline and why are they offline? And then finally, what are the key barriers to getting online, and how does not having access at home affect Detroiters? We did telephone surveys together with Wayne State University, who did the telephone surveys for us. And we did focus groups in the neighborhoods. We went to Cody Rouge, 7-8 Mile Woodward, and Milwaukee Junction. So if you're familiar with Detroit, you know these are some of the average and more hard-hit areas in Detroit that we went to. The first myth that I wanted to debunk is that Detroiters are offline. And they are, to a certain extent, but they really are not. So we asked people if they were internet users, and we asked all sorts of different things. So we asked, do you have internet access at home? Do you use your phone to go online? Do you use social media? And so by combining all these things, because people don't necessarily always understand what the internet is, it's a bit of a complex concept sometimes. So by asking all sorts of different questions, we were able to figure out that almost all of our sample were internet users. And I have to put that in context because our sample was primarily older, primarily female, and primarily African American. And so these are traditionally, in the national data, people who are less likely to use the internet. And so we see here almost everyone was online. Something that was interesting was that 3/4 said they have access to the internet at home. But when we asked about whether they have a contract with an ISP, only 62% said yes. And from the focus groups, I don't have enough time to go into them, but it was really interesting to see how creative Detroiters were in getting online. And so they would share networks with their neighbors. One of the quotes was, well, if it's open, if it doesn't have a password, it's an open door, it's an invite. So you just log on to the network. Some people used their phones as hotspots in their homes to make sure their kids could do their homework and things like that. But then we would run into issues like data caps. So in the focus groups, that kept coming up over and over again, that people said, I'm running into a data cap, either I get overage fees or I actually have to turn it off. So that's a big issue. But Detroiters are online and they want to be online. Second myth is Detroiters are not interested in the internet. We hear that all the time. Well, you know, at this point, anyone who wants to be online can be online, right? That's not what we found. So for the reasons for being offline that we asked people who were not having an ISP contract, yes, not interested is up there, but we asked all their reasons. And so you can also see pretty much the same level. It was just too expensive. And this is something that we heard in the focus groups again and again and again. I can tell you an anecdote about that later in person, but I don't have time. And then also when we look at their attitudes, they're pretty positive. People really think the internet is good. It's efficient. It's useful. So all these are positive attitudes. So it's efficient, saves time, etc. And so these are agreement means. The higher the value, the more they would agree with this. And then we also looked at negative attitudes, which are a lot lower in general. But again, privacy came up as an issue. So something we can address. The third myth that we hear a lot is that Detroiters or low-income and distressed populations in general only use the internet for entertainment. And that is not at all what we found. Not at all. Not in the least. So again, hard to read because it's too small, but email and info seeking, those were the most popular ones. And then things like streaming videos were very, very low. And then again, we also see this actually stratified by who has an ISP and who does not. So we see big differences here. So the lighter green is people who don't have an ISP. Darker green is they have an ISP. And one of the biggest contrasts here is shopping. And you might think that's not that important, but if you've been to those neighborhoods, shopping is not easy there. And so from things like, you know, just buying healthy food potentially, or, you know, just clothing, anything. If you can order it online and you can potentially even get it cheaper, that's a big deal. And we see a big difference here. So home internet access is very important. So my key takeaways here are that we have a multifaceted problem. We don't just have the rural areas who are underconnected. We also have distressed urban areas that are very underconnected. And so we need to look at all of those areas at the same time. We can't focus on one and forget about the other. The other one is that Michiganders are acutely aware of the importance of the internet. The myth that people who are offline at this point are not interested, it's not true. It's not at all what we found in any of our studies. When we talk to people in focus groups, surveys, what have you, that's not at all what we find in the data. So we have to be aware that people want to be online, and they want to be online on more than just a phone. In some of the focus groups, we heard that Detroiters are actually prioritizing their ISP bills and their cell phone bills over other bills to make sure they stay connected because they were aware of how important it is to stay online. Something else we found, especially in the survey data, is mobile access is not enough. It is not the cure to the digital divide. Yes, it's a step in the right direction, but as you saw with the ISP data there, if you don't have home access, you have a very, very different experience online, and it's just not good enough. Cost is a major barrier, so we still have to work with that. We have amazing programs, but there is also some lack of awareness sometimes that people don't actually know that programs like Internet Essentials are available. Some people find it a little too difficult to sign up, so they give up. So if we can help with things like that, that will be great as well. And then some Michiganders are a little worried about issues like privacy. And this is, I think, something that's just gonna keep happening as we hear more and more things in the media. But again, this is something we can address. And that's my final takeaway, really. All of the issues that we have can be addressed. And we've heard great options already here. And I'm sure that Eric and Kevin will mention some more. And with that, thank you for your time.